Imagine growing up in a family where love wasn't chosen, it was commanded. Where the person you were told to marry wasn't a stranger, but your own brother. This isn't a twisted folktale or some medieval horror. It happened here, in America. And the story only gets darker the deeper you go. Before we unravel this disturbing tale, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this is only one of many hidden stories buried in America's past that most people were never meant to hear. She was forced to marry her brother. That single horrifying truth is at the center of America's most disturbing inbreeding scandal. But like every nightmare, it didn't begin with violence or chaos or anything that might immediately alert the outside world. No. It began with something deceptively ordinary. A quiet farmhouse on the edge of town. A family who seemed to prefer their own company. To the casual passerby, nothing about them stood out. Their clothes were plain, their routines predictable. They went to town rarely, and when they did, they kept their heads down. To most neighbors, they were simply another reclusive household, tucked away in the folds of rural America. But behind that veil of simplicity, the foundations of something monstrous were already being laid. The home itself sat like a fortress against the outside world, a weather-beaten structure surrounded by thick trees and fields that stretched endlessly. It wasn't just distance that kept others away, it was atmosphere. A heaviness lingered around that land, an unspoken warning to leave them be. Visitors weren't welcome, questions weren't tolerated, and boundaries weren't crossed. The family lived behind invisible walls, and the community quickly learned it was easier not to pry. But that isolation was no accident. It was carefully engineered. At the heart of it all stood the patriarch, a man whose beliefs ruled the household, like law carved in stone. To him, the outside world was poison. Neighbors, schools, even churches that weren't his own interpretation of truth. He saw them as corrupting forces. His voice carried weight not just because he was a father, but because he was a prophet in his own eyes. Every decision he made, every rule he enforced, was framed as divine will. To question him was to question God. And so the family obeyed, not out of choice, but out of fear and conviction twisted into one. What began as a rejection of society's temptations soon morphed into something far darker. The children grew up with no playmates beyond each other, no influences besides the words spoken inside those walls. Books were forbidden unless approved. Stories were filtered. Knowledge was rationed. Each child was taught that their blood was sacred, set apart from the filth of the outside. To marry beyond the family, they were told, was to taint that sacred line. And slowly, quietly, the idea of marrying one's own siblings wasn't shocking at all. It was destiny. Neighbors sometimes wondered why the children never attended school, why they weren't seen at local gatherings, why the family always kept to themselves. But suspicion never became action. In small towns, privacy is respected, sometimes to a fault. And so the silence stretched on, year after year, while inside that home a doctrine of control took root. The patriarch would stand before his family and speak of purity, of chosen bloodlines, of God's will demanding separation from outsiders. His children absorbed every word, their young minds molded into believing the world beyond their gates was dangerous, evil, and unworthy. The home became its own universe. Meals were eaten together under strict rules, prayers were repeated until voices trembled, and every conversation reinforced the same chilling truth. Loyalty to family meant obedience, and obedience meant sacrifice. There was no room for doubt, no space for rebellion. Even the smallest flicker of resistance was met with punishment disguised as discipline. The children didn't know freedom because they had never tasted it. They didn't question why their lives were so different, because difference itself had been painted as sin. On the rare occasions they ventured into town, the children were silent shadows. Their eyes never lingered on strangers. Their mouths rarely spoke. Locals described them as polite but unsettlingly detached. They were present yet absent. Children who seemed to exist only halfway in the world, tethered to something far stronger than ordinary family bonds. And that was exactly how the patriarch wanted it. For him, The less the children saw of the outside world, the less likely they were to stray from the path he had carved. Behind closed doors, however, the teachings grew more explicit, more suffocating. As the children aged into adolescence, whispers of what their futures would hold began to surface. Marriage, yes, but not to outsiders. The family's blood, he said, was chosen. It was their duty to keep it pure. Outsiders would never understand. Outsiders would never be worthy. And so, with each passing year, the boundary between sibling and spouse blurred in their minds, planted by the man they were told to obey above all. The farmhouse, once merely a symbol of isolation, had transformed into a cage. The family inside had no chains, no locks keeping them bound, and yet they were prisoners all the same. They lived in fear of a world they had never known, and in devotion to a man who had rewritten the very meaning of family. The seeds of generational horror were planted not in violence but in whispers, in rules, in an ideology that promised purity but delivered devastation. And while the world outside continued on, oblivious, the children inside that farmhouse grew older. Each step they took brought them closer to the future their father had designed for them, a future where their bloodline would be preserved, no matter the cost. What none of them realized was that the first cracks in this fragile, horrifying system were already forming. And when they broke, the truth would be more shocking than anyone could imagine. The doctrine didn't come from nowhere. It was crafted, rehearsed, and delivered with the weight of holy authority. The patriarch of the family believed he wasn't just a father, but a chosen vessel of God. Every word he spoke was laced with the language of Scripture, every command backed by the fear of eternal damnation. He preached to his children not as a parent but as a prophet, and his message was clear. Their blood was sacred, set apart, and to preserve it was not just a duty, but the only path to salvation. To stray from that path meant destruction, not just of their family but of their souls. He would gather them in the dim light of the farmhouse living room, the cracked leather Bible in his hands worn thin from obsessive use. Page after page, he would bend words to his will. Old Testament laws about purity and separation became proof of his claims. Passages about chosen tribes and bloodlines were torn from their context and weaponized. His voice would rise with fury as he condemned outsiders as wolves in sheep's clothing, instruments of Satan sent to destroy what was holy. His children, young and impressionable, sat wide-eyed, absorbing every word. To them, it wasn't manipulation, it was truth. But his sermons didn't stop at warnings. They escalated into prophecies. He told his children that a great reckoning was coming, that the world beyond their fences was collapsing under sin and corruption. Schools were dens of evil. Churches were compromised by false teachings. Neighbors were infected by immorality. Only within the family, he said, could purity be maintained. Only by marrying each other could they remain holy when the apocalypse arrived. The terrifying part wasn't just the belief itself. It was how thoroughly it consumed them. By the time the children reached adolescence, their world was already rewritten. They didn't dream of lives beyond the farm, because they had been convinced such lives didn't exist. Journal entries discovered later painted a chilling picture. In one, a daughter wrote of lying awake at night, hearing her father's words, echoing in her mind, telling her she would one day be a wife for the chosen. She described feeling sick, terrified, yet unable to imagine any alternative. Another son wrote of guilt, convinced that even looking at a girl outside the family was a betrayal of God. These weren't private fears. They were the intended result of years of conditioning. Court documents later revealed how violence reinforced this doctrine. Doubt was a sin, and sin demanded punishment. If a child dared to question the rules, they faced the father's wrath. Beatings were framed as corrections, meant to drive out weakness and rebellion. Neighbors occasionally heard screams but brushed them off as discipline, unaware or unwilling to admit the severity of what was happening inside. Over time, fear carved itself into obedience. The children didn't just comply because they believed. They complied because they knew resistance meant pain. The mother, too, played her role, though her complicity came from silence. Whether through fear of her husband or belief in his twisted faith, she reinforced his rules. At meals, she would remind the children of their special purpose. During prayers, she would echo his warnings of outsiders. Her voice lacked the fury of his sermons, but her quiet reinforcement carried its own weight. In that house, there was no counterpoint, no escape hatch of reason. Every voice, every word pointed back to the same unbreakable truth. Purity must be protected, even at the cost of humanity. Over the years, this doctrine hardened into destiny. The children were never asked if they agreed. They were told what their futures would be. The eldest daughter, in particular, became the focus of whispered promises and cryptic remarks about her duty. She wasn't told she might one day choose a partner. She was told she would become the wife of her brother, and that in doing so she would honor God. It was framed as holy sacrifice, the highest form of loyalty. And when she cried, when she begged for another way, she was met with chilling words. To refuse is to condemn us all. This wasn't faith. It was weaponized religion, stripped of hope and twisted into control. The children weren't growing up with spiritual guidance, they were growing up with indoctrination so deep, it rewired their sense of morality. Every teaching pointed inward. Every law led back to the family itself. The outside world faded into a phantom of sin, while their bloodline was exalted as sacred. The doctrine of purity was complete, and the children, scarred, beaten, and brainwashed, were ready to fulfill it. What none of them realized was that the promises their father preached didn't lead to salvation. They led to devastation. And soon those words from his cracked Bible would turn into the most horrifying reality of all. She was still a child when her father told her the words that would shatter her life forever. She would not marry a stranger, nor would she wait until she was grown. Her destiny was already chosen. She was to be the wife of her own brother. The boy she had played with in dirt fields, the one she had argued with over chores, the one who shared her blood. Overnight, he would become her husband. There was no discussion, no space for her voice, no chance to resist. In her father's world, obedience was salvation and refusal meant damnation. She was barely a teenager, and yet her future was sealed in chains she could never escape. The day of the wedding was stripped of everything a wedding is meant to be. There were no guests, no laughter, no flowers, no white dress. Instead, it was conducted in a dim room of the farmhouse with only family present. Her father stood in place of a preacher, his cracked Bible opened, his booming voice declaring what God supposedly demanded. The children gathered around, confused, some too young to grasp the gravity of what they were witnessing. For them, it was simply another ritual in a house filled with rituals. But for her, it was a nightmare unfolding in real time. Her hands shook as she was pushed forward, her brother beside her, equally pale, equally terrified. The ceremony was crude, a few verses twisted from scripture, a demand for vows, a command to seal their union not with love, but with obedience. She was instructed to promise her loyalty, her body, her life to her brother, who stood frozen, silent, his eyes darting anywhere but hers. It was less a marriage than a transaction, her father's ideology becoming flesh, his doctrine written into the lives of his children. And when it was over, there was no celebration, no joy, only silence. The silence of children too young to speak, the silence of siblings too confused to process, the silence of a mother who did nothing to intervene. For the brother, the burden was no lighter. He was young, torn between duty and revulsion, forced into a role he never wanted. In his private writings, later uncovered, he spoke of guilt, of shame, of feeling trapped between his father's authority and his own conscience. But in that household, conscience didn't matter. Choice didn't matter, only obedience. He knew, just as she did, that resistance meant punishment, not just for him, but for everyone. So he played the role, even as it destroyed him from within. Night after the ceremony, she lay awake in her bed, Her stomach twisted, her mind racing. She was no longer a sister. She was a wife. A child wife bound to her brother under the guise of holiness. The walls of the farmhouse felt tighter than ever, pressing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of what had just been done. And yet, beyond those walls, life went on as if nothing had changed. The neighbors still drove past the farm, still nodded politely when they saw the family in town. Whispers circulated, strange rumors about what went on behind closed doors, but no one dared confront them. In small communities, suspicion dies in silence. People convince themselves it's not their business, not their problem. And so, the truth remained hidden. The younger children who had been present that day carried the image with them long after. Some were too small to understand, but they felt the unease, the tension, the wrongness that lingered in the air. Others were old enough to realize what had been done but powerless to intervene. The wedding became one more secret in a house full of secrets, a moment spoken of only in whispers, if at all. And as the days turned into weeks, the horror of that ceremony hardened into reality. She was expected to fulfill her role. He was expected to act as her husband. The father watched them closely, reminding them that their union was holy, that their sacrifice was keeping the family pure. What should have been the beginning of a young girl's life, the years of learning, dreaming, growing, had instead become the end of her freedom. She was bound, body and soul, to a fate she never chose. And as she stared into the hollow eyes of her brother-turned-husband, she realized the nightmare wasn't just one day. It was every day that would follow. But what no one in that farmhouse yet understood was how this forced marriage, this twisted ceremony, would set into motion a cycle of suffering that could never truly be hidden. A cycle that would soon spill out of the farmhouse walls and into the public eye, exposing horrors darker than anyone outside could have ever imagined. The first child was born in silence. There was no doctor, no nurse, no sterile hospital room filled with the hum of machines. Only the cramped farmhouse bedroom, the smell of sweat and fear and the weight of expectation pressing down like a suffocating fog. The daughter, now a mother before she was ready to even understand what motherhood meant, screamed into the walls while her own mother held her hand. The father stood nearby, not with compassion, but with judgment. To him, this birth wasn't about pain or joy. It was proof. Proof that his doctrine was working, that purity was being preserved, that his twisted vision was taking root in flesh and blood. But the child wasn't born healthy. From the very beginning, the cruel consequences of forced inbreeding began to show. His tiny body trembled with seizures, his features marked by abnormalities the family refused to acknowledge. The father called it a test of faith, claiming the child was chosen, that his suffering was a sign of divine favor. Yet in the quiet of night the mother would cradle him, tears streaming down her face, knowing this was not holiness. It was tragedy. As the years passed, more children were born, each carrying the scars of a bloodline folded in on itself. Some suffered from severe developmental delays, unable to walk or speak with ease. Others were plagued with chronic illnesses that no prayer could cure. Their bodies bore the silent testimony of a cycle that should never have begun, and yet with each pregnancy, the father's conviction only grew stronger. He saw deformities not as warnings, but as signs that outsiders would never understand. To him, every frail breath, every broken body, was a victory against a corrupt world. The daughter, trapped in her role as mother and wife, carried the heaviest burden. Every pregnancy was a reminder of her imprisonment, every birth a scar etched deeper into her soul. She did not weep openly anymore, her tears had dried into resignation. Her children, each one innocent, each one condemned by a fate they had no part in choosing, became living symbols of her entrapment. To hold them was to feel both love and despair, a love that any mother feels, but poisoned by the knowledge that their suffering was not natural. It was inflicted. Neighbors began to notice. Children glimpsed at a distance looked different, moved differently, spoke strangely. Whispers started in hushed tones, rumors of deformities, of sickness, of something unnatural in that house. Yet still, nothing was done. The family's isolation protected them, their silence serving as a shield. Social workers visited occasionally, prompted by anonymous tips, but the father's charisma and rehearsed sermons about privacy and religious freedom pushed them back. The truth remained sealed within the farmhouse walls. Medical records that later surfaced told the story with brutal clarity. Doctors who treated the children described conditions rarely seen outside of genetic research papers: severe facial deformities, cognitive impairment, weakened immune systems. Some children lived only a few short years, their lives ending before they could even understand the world they were born into. Others survived, but with lifelong disabilities that made every day a struggle. Each record was a silent indictment, evidence of what happens when love is replaced by ideology, when family becomes a prison rather than a refuge. The children themselves, as they grew older, carried not only the physical scars but the psychological ones. They knew they were different. They felt the stares when they ventured into town. They heard the laughter of other children, laughter they could never join. Some grew angry, lashing out in confusion, unable to understand why they had been cursed from birth. Others sank into silence, retreating into the shadows of the farmhouse, their spirits broken before they even had a chance to form. And through it all, the father remained steadfast. To him, there was no tragedy, no cruelty, only fulfillment. He preached that their suffering was holy, that their broken bodies were shields against sin, that their pain was proof of their chosen status. His children, robbed of choice, robbed of freedom, robbed even of health, became pawns in a game of control disguised as faith. The daughter, now a mother many times over, no longer recognized herself. Her body bore the marks of repeated childbirth, her spirit worn thin by grief. She had become a vessel, nothing more, forced to carry the weight of generations, poisoned by a doctrine she had never chosen. She looked into the eyes of her children and saw reflections of her own despair, and she knew this was not the beginning of a family. It was the birth of broken generations, each one chained to the sins of the father. But as the children grew, as their differences became harder to hide, whispers turned to questions, and questions turned to suspicion. The walls of silence that had protected the family for so long were beginning to crack, and what seeped through those cracks would soon expose a truth so disturbing it could no longer be ignored. For decades, the family remained a shadow on the edge of town, living as though the rest of the world did not exist. Their isolation was total, deliberate, and unchallenged. From a distance, the farmhouse looked innocuous, just another weathered structure tucked between fields. But those who lived nearby began to notice things that didn't add up. Children who should have been in school wandered the property, their movements stiff, their eyes wary. Siblings carried themselves with a peculiar uniformity, as if molded to a single unspoken rule. Something about them unsettled the neighbors, though no one could quite put their finger on it. And the father? He always appeared calm, polite even, whenever anyone came too close, hiding the storm that raged behind closed doors. Whispers began slowly, creeping from one household to another.
"Have you seen the children?" a neighbor might ask in passing. "They look off." Others noticed how rarely anyone visited, how the family's presence in town was fleeting and guarded. The mother, quiet and reserved, never offered explanations.
And the children's blank expressions only fueled suspicion. But the whispers were hushed, almost ashamed, as if speaking too loudly would make them complicit. For years, these murmurs amounted to nothing. People told themselves it was none of their business, or that perhaps the family was simply eccentric, deeply religious, or just peculiar. Eventually, the whispers turned into official concern. Social workers were called to investigate, prompted by tips from neighbors who could no longer ignore the unease gnawing at them. Investigators arrived with checklists and forms, stepping carefully onto the property. Yet their visits were fleeting, constrained and polite. The father's rehearsed sermons and carefully measured words charmed and intimidated them in equal measure. He spoke of religious freedom, parental rights, and the sanctity of the family, masking coercion with conviction. To outsiders, everything seemed lawful, orderly, and under control. Nothing overtly illegal could be proven, and the family was left undisturbed, free to continue its patterns. Over time, more red flags appeared. Children were seen with strange behaviors, sometimes exhibiting developmental delays, sometimes speaking in strange, rehearsed phrases that mirrored their father's doctrine. A neighbor noticed bruises once subtle and quickly explained away. Another reported hearing screams late at night, but by morning, the house was quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. Each report was filed, noted, and quietly dismissed. The system, unprepared or unwilling, failed to intervene. Silence became complicity. Meanwhile, life inside the farmhouse remained rigid and unchanging. The children had learned that the outside world was not to be trusted, that any interference would be met with cunning defenses and calculated manipulation. They rarely ventured beyond the property, and when they did, fear guided their steps. The father's voice had conditioned them to expect judgment, punishment, and exile if they disobeyed. Within this controlled environment, abuse thrived, hidden in plain sight, unnoticed by almost everyone and impossible to escape. Neighbors continued to whisper, their curiosity tinged with guilt, frustration, and unease. They wanted to act, but the family's secrecy and the father's commanding presence made it nearly impossible. People rationalized their inaction. Maybe the children were just shy, maybe the father's strictness was cultural or religious. The truth, horrifying and undeniable, was just beyond reach. For decades, the family existed in a bubble of silence, their twisted way of life shielded by distance, fear, and willful ignorance. But whispers, by nature, are contagious. What began as suspicion started to grow, gaining momentum with every neighbor who noticed the unusual behavior, every child who returned from the farmhouse with a vacant expression, every unexplained injury or illness. The tension in the town grew quietly, an undercurrent of dread that something was profoundly wrong, yet still no one dared cross the fence. The house remained an enigma, the family an untouchable presence. And as the years stretched on, the cracks in their isolation began to widen. The whispers were growing louder. Eyes that had once turned away now lingered. Questions were beginning to be asked. The delicate facade that had protected the family for so long was showing its first signs of strain. The silence that had allowed abuse to thrive so long was about to be challenged, and when it was, no one would be prepared for the horrors that would spill out from behind those walls. The day began like any other, but inside the farmhouse, tension had reached a breaking point. For years, the family's twisted world had existed in silence, hidden behind isolation and fear. But secrecy has a way of collapsing under its own weight, and that morning marked the first real crack. A child, sick and unable to bear the pain any longer, was rushed to a local hospital. It wasn't just a minor illness. This was a result of years of neglect, compounded by the genetic consequences of forced inbreeding. Medical staff were immediately alarmed, noting injuries and abnormalities that didn't match the parents' explanations. What they saw wasn't just disease, it was evidence, screaming for intervention. Hospital staff were unprepared for the story that would unfold. As the child trembled on a hospital bed, whispers of the family's past began to surface. Nurses and doctors, initially cautious, were soon joined by social workers who had been following scattered reports for years. The moment authorities stepped into the hospital room, the invisible walls of the farmhouse began to crumble. For decades, the family had evaded scrutiny through fear, manipulation, and isolation. But the moment their children were forced into the public eye, there was no way to hide. Soon, investigators were piecing together years of scattered evidence, journal entries from the children, medical records, neighbor testimonies, and even photographs smuggled out by concerned friends. Each piece was a dam breaking under pressure. Court documents later revealed the horrifying scope of what had occurred. Not just one forced marriage, but a pattern of inbreeding maintained over generations. Children systematically manipulated and indoctrinated, abuse normalized under the guise of religious duty. Every testimony was more shocking than the last. One child described the wedding to their brother, their voice trembling as they recounted words forced upon them in the name of faith. Another described the beatings, the whispered threats, the isolation that had shaped their entire understanding of the world. The courtroom itself became a stage for horror few outside could imagine. Family members, some still children, sat with wide eyes and trembling hands as lawyers read aloud confessions they had written, statements that painted a portrait of cruelty and control. The mother, a figure of quiet complicity, wept openly, her tears a mixture of grief, guilt, and fear. Neighbors who had whispered behind closed doors now watched openly, stunned, unable to comprehend how they had missed the signs for so long. And then the patriarch entered, the man who had orchestrated the entire nightmare. His presence was almost surreal, calm, measured, and astonishingly unrepentant. He denied wrongdoing with the same fervor he had used to enforce obedience for decades. He claimed righteousness, insisting that his actions were guided by God, that his children had been protected, not harmed. The courtroom held its breath as jurors and families alike struggled to reconcile the lack of remorse with the scope of horror his own children had described. It was a chilling reminder of how conviction can blind a person to humanity, and how evil can wear the mask of devotion. As the trial progressed, the stories of abuse and neglect became impossible to ignore. Witnesses spoke of broken bodies, broken minds, and broken lives. The children, some barely more than teenagers themselves, recounted years of indoctrination, forced marriages, and pregnancies they were too young to carry. Each account compounded the weight of reality, revealing the full extent of the trauma. The evidence was irrefutable, and the patriarch's defense faltered under the sheer scale of testimony and documentation. By the end of the day, the world knew what had happened behind those farmhouse walls. The horror was no longer hidden, no longer whispered, no longer protected by isolation or fear. And yet, even as authorities took control, even as the first steps toward justice were taken, a grim truth remained. Decades of abuse could not be undone. Lives had been irreparably damaged, innocence lost, and the scars of that doctrine of bloodlines would linger forever. The world now knew the truth, but for many of those trapped inside, it was far too late to change what had already been done. Even after the gavel fell, even after the patriarch was removed from the house that had been both sanctuary and prison, the aftermath of the family's twisted legacy lingered like a shadow that refused to lift. The arrests brought a fleeting sense of relief to the outside world. But for those who had lived inside those walls, relief was complicated, almost impossible to feel. The scars ran far deeper than bruises or broken bones. They were etched into minds, hearts, and the very fabric of their identities. Every survivor carried the weight of a childhood stolen, of innocence shattered, of being born into something they had no hand in creating. For them, freedom did not feel like liberation. It felt like the start of a journey they had no map for. Some fled the state entirely, cutting ties with family, hometowns, and any remnants of the life that had defined them. They changed names, relocated, and sought to bury the memories beneath new jobs, new faces, and new cities. Yet the past has a way of following you. One survivor described waking in the middle of the night, heart pounding, only to realize she was recalling the quiet, suffocating rules of her father's house. Another struggled to trust anyone because the very people meant to protect her, as a child, had been her jailers. Trust once broken in such a fundamental way is nearly impossible to rebuild. Others remained closer to home, tethered by poverty, community ties, or obligations to the younger siblings who had not yet escaped. For them, the shadow of the past was omnipresent. They watched the news coverage, read the court transcripts, and felt the judgment of the world settle on them, even though they were victims. Every glance, every whispered question from neighbors, reminded them that their lives were marked, that their bloodline carried shame in the eyes of society. Even as the patriarch sat behind bars, the family's suffering continued, less visible, more insidious, and persistent. The children, now adolescents, and young adults, struggled to reconcile what they had been forced to endure with the lives they were meant to live. Therapy sessions revealed the depth of psychological damage: anxiety that paralyzed, depression that silenced, anger that could erupt without warning. Many wrestled with identity, unsure whether they were merely survivors or products of something abhorrent, something beyond their control. Romantic relationships, friendships, and even family bonds outside the household were fraught with hesitation and fear. The lessons instilled by the father, that love was conditional, loyalty was absolute, and blood was sacred, were difficult to unlearn. Even physical health bore the burden of the past. Generations of inbreeding left some with chronic illnesses, genetic disorders, and developmental issues. Doctors' appointments became frequent, each diagnosis a reminder that the damage of the father's doctrine was more than psychological. It was biological. For every survivor who escaped the house with their mind intact, their body sometimes carried proof that they were trapped by fate, not choice. It was a cruel, inescapable legacy, one that forced them to confront every day that the sins of one generation had consequences for the next. Yet in the midst of despair, there were moments of resilience. Some survivors discovered communities of support, networks of people who had endured abuse and isolation. They learned to speak, to name their trauma, to reclaim pieces of their stolen humanity. One daughter began writing letters she would never send, cataloging her experiences in the hope of understanding herself. A son joined therapy groups where silence was replaced with conversation, shame replaced with solidarity. Step by step, they worked to reconstruct what had been systematically destroyed. And yet, even as they began to heal, the shadow remained. The legacy of abuse is not something that dies with a courtroom verdict. It lingers in bloodlines, in memories, in patterns learned and repeated unconsciously. The survivors understood this more than anyone. The past is never truly past. Even in freedom, they were haunted by the echoes of a home where love and violence were indistinguishable, where obedience had been carved into their very bones. The story of this family is a reminder that cycles of abuse do not end with a single arrest or a single trial. They ripple outward, sometimes for decades, sometimes for generations, leaving scars that are invisible, but no less real. For those who lived it, the nightmare did not conclude with the law. It persisted in every heartbeat, every choice, every tentative step toward a life they had only just begun to claim. And as long as the echoes of that house remain, the shadow of its bloodlines will never fully disappear. Even as the courtroom doors closed and the headlines faded, the questions lingered, heavy and unrelenting. How many more families existed in shadows like this one, hidden in plain sight, practicing horrors that the world would never see? This case, shocking and almost unimaginable, feels like an anomaly, a grotesque outlier in the fabric of American life. But experts in sociology, psychology, and criminal behavior caution that it is anything but unique. Isolation, secrecy, and unchecked authority are fertile ground for cruelty, especially when combined with rigid ideology and the manipulation of faith. Rural corners, cloistered communities, and families bound by cult-like beliefs create environments where abuse can thrive unobserved, sometimes for generations. Psychologists describe the mechanisms that allow such cycles to persist. When children are removed from external influence, their understanding of morality, consent, and love is shaped exclusively by the adults controlling their environment. Indoctrination replaces education. Fear replaces choice. Obedience replaces affection. Communities that value privacy and autonomy can unintentionally shield these horrors from scrutiny. One expert notes that when the outside world is framed as corrupt, evil, or dangerous, children internalize the message so completely that they no longer see themselves as victims. They see themselves as participants in a sacred mission. And when abuse is justified by religious or ideological conviction, the perpetrators themselves are often unrepentant, convinced that the world outside simply cannot understand their righteousness. Historical cases echo these warnings. From isolated polygamist sects to tightly controlled religious communes, there are chilling similarities. Children hidden from schools, adults enforcing rigid hierarchies, abuse normalized under the guise of morality or divine purpose. Even in modern society with its surveillance, social programs, and child protection agencies, these patterns continue to emerge. Experts warn that vigilance is the only safeguard, but detection is difficult when fear, shame, and secrecy are deeply ingrained. Communities may whisper about the unusual, but the combination of distance, obedience, and intimidation can keep horrors like this invisible for decades. Yet there is another dimension to consider: the ripple effect on survivors. Those who escape may carry trauma for a lifetime, but the systems that fail to intervene allow the abuse to continue unchecked. Without intervention, secrecy becomes self-perpetuating. A child who grows up in these conditions may, without guidance or escape, repeat the patterns, perpetuating cycles of abuse and isolation. And in remote regions, where neighbors are scarce and authorities slow to respond, these cycles are particularly resilient. The horror, in other words, does not need to be widespread to remain dangerous. It only needs to exist in pockets hidden from view. Zooming out further, one begins to see the landscape of America differently. Behind quiet fields, under the cover of forests, tucked away in small towns, there are countless homes whose stories are never told. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hum of tractors across farmland, the faint light of windows in houses no one visits. These are the subtle markers of lives that may be lived in isolation, some healthy, some twisted. And the truth is chilling. For every case exposed, there may be 10 more that remain unknown, their victims silenced before they can even recognize the abuse. The lessons of this family are clear, but unsettling. They demonstrate the extremes to which ideology, secrecy, and control can drive human behavior. They reveal how obedience, fear, and isolation can warp generations. They remind us that vigilance is not just a moral obligation. It is a safeguard against horrors that refuse to stay in the past. And they force a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the darkest chapters of human behavior are not written in history books. They are still unfolding quietly, in places we might never think to look. As the camera of imagination drifts across America's heartland, the wind carrying whispers of forgotten homes, the silence is almost deafening. The empty porches, the unmowed fields, the faint glimmer of light in distant windows, each holds a story, and some may hold horrors yet to be revealed. For those willing to listen, the message is hauntingly clear. The nightmare does not always end when the doors of one house are forced open. Sometimes it persists, lingering in bloodlines, shadowed by ideology, and waiting for the next crack in the world's awareness to continue. The quiet, deceptive stillness of these places reminds us that even in modern America, evil can hide, and some of the darkest stories are still very much alive.